Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur, talking today about DEI and identity politics. I mean, what's happening in our Canadian universities? Are they hiring people based on merit? Now, there's a concept, right? And on the other hand, is it because of things like skin color, sexual orientation, or gender, perhaps? So we'll tackle that in just a second here. Quick reminder first to hit subscribe. And our guest today joining us from Calgary, Dr. Mark Milke. He's an author, a public policy analyst, and the president of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. Their website is aristotlefoundation.org. And so good to have you with us, Mark.
Thanks for having me on, Paul.
Yeah, looking forward to the conversation here. Lots to cover here. You know, what kind of got me onto this here, I saw a news article, and it was about a university hiring based on DEI. And the actual job posting read as follows: the faculties of Computer Science and Health at Dalhousie University invite applications for a Canadian Institutes of Health Research Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Artificial Intelligence and Healthy Aging. Now, this position is designated to candidates who self-identify as women with a disability or gender equity seeking persons with a disability. So let's check, because I went, what? So if I'm understanding this correctly, the person applying doesn't actually have to be a biological woman, just self-identifying as such, and ostensibly doesn't actually have to have a real disability as long as they they feel that they have a disability, and it doesn't specify what kind of disability. Could be anything, right? So I just thought to myself, when did common sense, exit the building, Mark?
Well, maybe we should, let's take a kind of the big picture look at DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Look, and
sure,
in theory, nobody wants to be against diversity, or at least I don't think that's why.
Of course.
One of the best examples from history I give is Japan shut itself off from the world for 2.5 centuries. And when it opened up in the mid-19th century, it wasn't stronger, it was weaker. It was technologically behind. It hadn't kept up with cultural trends. It hadn't, as successful cultures do, it hadn't had the time to beg, borrow, or steal from other cultures in advance, because that's really what helps an individual or an entire nation state advance, is finding out what works out there and copying it. So in theory, diversity, which is, Canada is pretty diverse. You see people from all over the planet here. In theory, that's, I think, a pretty good thing, because you want people to, if you want to do trade ties with Asia, you might want to have someone from China or South Korea or Japan or Taiwan who understands the culture and so forth. So diversity in theory, not just in theory, can be a very good thing, but people have to define what they mean by it. The problem with diversity, equity, and inclusion is it's really a newer version of what's called affirmative action or employment equity. Again, also words that sound very nice, but in essence, what they come down to is they discriminate against people based on skin color, ethnicity, gender. And again, even this comes from a good place. People look in history and say, well, a century ago, people that look like you discriminated against people that look like me. Shouldn't we do the same now? No, we shouldn't, because it treats people as not as individuals in law and policy, but as you look like someone who once acted badly or part of a group that once acted badly, therefore we can justify discriminating against you today. Let me give you a clear example of why this is a very poor idea. About 20 years ago, the federal government started to tell the fishery on the West Coast, the commercial fishery, they were going to have to stand aside for a native-only fishing
right
on the West Coast. There was no problem to solve. The commercial fishery at the time was 30% native, which is a much greater proportion of natives vis-a-vis the British Columbia population, or indigenous, as the term is used today. Well, they basically disrupted an entirely successful organic success story, the commercial fishery, with non-natives and natives doing very well by having a one-day only a native fishery. A native fishing day, because sometimes on the West Coast commercial fishery at the time, there was only one day that you could fish, and that meant everyone else had to sit out for an entire year. I remember talking to someone of Japanese ancestry from the commercial fishery who said, look, a century ago, my grandfather in the 1920s was discriminated against because he was Japanese ancestry. The whites didn't like him. A century later, she was being discriminated against because of her ancestry, because she was Japanese Canadian, by this policy on Indigenous people, which I'm not arguing all Indigenous people supported. They didn't.
Of course.
But the federal government intervened to pick favorites, and there was no need to. So the problem with DEI or affirmative action or employment equity, is it's attempting to tell you you are owed this or not owed this based on how you look. It is, as you started with, Paul, identity politics. It's destructive, it's divisive, it's anti-merit, it's illiberal.
Yeah, we want to be inclusive, and Canadians love that. And again, as you pointed out, that can be a good thing. But if it comes at the expense of, well, basically excluding the majority of Canadians for no other reason than how they look, that sort of thing, that's wrong. I mean, as a young man, I spent a little bit of time in the trades. I worked with an Indigenous fellow. You know what? He was the best worker. I mean, you check off, what do you want in an employee, right? You want somebody who's good at the job. They're skilled. They're competent. They're diligent. You can trust them. They're friendly. They're on time. All these things, right? And now, so if I was running a company today, I would love to hire that guy. But you know what? Not because he's Indigenous, because he checks off all the qualifications, right?
Yeah, and DEI is often justified based on differences in outcomes. The average incomes, for example, of Indigenous Canadians are lower than those of white Canadians, who, by the way, are lower than those of East Asian Canadians. But there are reasons for this. The averages don't tell you much. Why are East Asian Canadians why is the average income of East Asian Canadians, Chinese, Korean ancestry, Japanese ancestry, why is it higher than those of white ancestry? Because East Asian Canadians have higher education levels than those with pale faces like you and me. So that explains part of the difference in economic outcomes. But people look at the averages and think, well, it must be discrimination. Well, not always, not often, actually. And actually, when you average or when you account for the apples to apple comparison, so for example, and we've done this, Matthew Lau, a Toronto financial analyst who has done a number of studies for us now on DEI, on affirmative action, that sort of thing, but went into the data, the Statistics Canada data. What Matthew found was when you actually look at apple to apple comparisons, so you take someone who's, say, in their 20s, doesn't matter if they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, if they have a degree, they work full year, full time. Again, same age range. They earn as much as each other. And in fact, someone with a master's degree or a PhD who's Indigenous will earn slightly more than other Canadians. Apple to apple comparisons in play. And what does that tell you? What it tells you is where's the discrimination? Because the incomes are the same or sometimes even higher for Indigenous Canadians. And again, there's a greater proportion of Indigenous Canadians in, say, poverty, where their incomes on average are lower. But again, part of that is explained by education levels. It's explained by a greater proportion of Indigenous Canadians live on reserves in the middle of nowhere, frankly. I mean, if you're in northern Manitoba, you do not have the same economic opportunities as someone in, say, downtown Toronto or downtown Vancouver. So that explains differences as well. But when you do the orange to orange or apple to apple comparisons, you actually find that Canadians earn pretty similar incomes when all the inputs are the same, is the best way to put it.
Right.
And it speaks to the notion that show us the racism, which, by the way, let me back up. No one in their right mind would say you can't find a racist today. I mean, go online or you can't meet a bigot.
Of course.
The point is, Canada began to change laws that allowed for systemic discrimination 70 years ago. In the case of Ontario, they banned discrimination based on color, in lodging, or gender, based in careers in the early 1950s. That was the systemic discrimination where you couldn't do anything about it before those laws were changed. But that was 70 years ago. So people too often confuse personal bigots or personal prejudice, which you can still find on occasion today, with the kind of systemic discrimination, the accusation, which has been outlawed in some cases for 70 years in Canada.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, we can't just resort back to this carte blanche. It's systemic racism because it's hard to justify with the stats you just shared there. Now, you recently did, the Aristotle Foundation did a study on DEI and academic hiring in public universities. And so what did that study look at and what did you actually find there?
Sure. This study called the University Discrimination Index, we looked at 10 universities and we looked at their most recent 50 staff hires, academic staff hires. And it was a pretty thorough look at, all of these ads, and we kind of ranked them. We had 9 different criteria. Do they say you can't have this job unless you are a certain color? The example you mentioned from the East Coast is an example where you had to be a woman or claim to be a woman, this sort of thing. So we went through all the ads. Literally, it was about 490, as I recall. And did they have evidence of DI, or did they require you to be a certain characteristic? Did they require you to submit a statement saying, "I love DEI. I think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread"? And there was a range, right? Or would they prefer you if you were, this or that, ethnicity? So we went through all of this, our researchers did, and compared them and then ranked them. And we found that most Canadian universities, like 97% of the job postings, had some form of reference to DI. Not always active discrimination. Just, do you support DI as a principle? But in some cases, active discrimination. Some universities were better than others. I recall it's been a while since I looked at the data, but I think the University of Alberta had fewer of those sorts of requirements. The University of Toronto and I believe UBC, for example, in Vancouver, had pretty high DEI requirements. And the point of this was, again, to basically say, look, you're assuming as a university that differences in outcomes between groups is explained by discrimination, not culture, not education, not family dynamics. The famous American economist Thomas Sowell once found out in his research, and he's done 50 years of this kind of research in an American context. If you take a Black American family and a white American family and they read to their kids when they're young, you're going to have very similar outcomes when they're older, so on and so forth. And if the couple stays married, again, very similar outcomes. So he had all sorts of interesting insights into what caused disparities in outcomes. And they were rarely racism, or it was hard to prove the racism existed in many cases. And this is Thomas Sowell, a Black American, grew up in Harlem for part of his life. It didn't have any incentive to deny white racism where he found it. So anyway, in our study of universities, we found that there was a great attachment to DEI, which again, at base, it's a very pleasant sounding word, diversity, equity, inclusion. But it is, when you go through it, the details are always, you're going to discriminate against an individual based on her ancestry, her skin color. Let me give an example from Calgary. A few years ago, the Haskayne School of Business had a position with a certain color that you had to be to get the position. And look, I don't want to say the color because I don't care if it's purple. I don't care if it's my skin color. I don't care if you're red with purple polka dots. I don't care what your faculty is composed of entirely or whatever. But it was offensive. And I said to the dean at the time of the Haskayne School of Business, how can you justify this? And he gave me the usual excuses, and he never read Thomas Sowell, didn't know who he was. And I said, what you're saying in this discriminatory ad is if you're the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, you're not eligible for this position, as if the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor is privileged. He didn't really have an answer for that, to be frank. And so, but this is the kind of nonsense that goes on because people don't think critically about what they're reading, what they're seeing, what the claims are behind DEI, which again is just, DEI is an old-fashioned, it comes from a good place. People don't want to discriminate. They want people to be accepted. I get it. But it breaks down because when you do the analysis, what you're saying to people is we don't want you because of how you look. How has this ever worked out well in human history?
Yeah, it's just not logical. It's not a common sense conclusion by any stretch of the imagination. So it is a bit hard for me to understand how highly educated people can fall into this trap. And again, like you're saying, 97, 98% of our universities doing so. Now, interesting. Pierre Poilievre, so a conservative opposition leader here, recently has started a petition, I believe, on this whole DE hiring thing. So I'm curious, has our federal government, do they actually have they established specific guidelines for public universities, because it's tax funded, right, with regard to hiring? So is this a requirement? And so they have to go through this DEI posting business, and is government funding attached to this? In other words, if you don't hire under these DEI policies, then we're going to withhold funding from your university. Is that where we're at? I'm not sure exactly what the...
For sure. Not just the federal government. The federal government has requirements, for example, when they fund universities and research. Okay. The SHIRT grants, as they're called, the full name is the Social and Humanities Research Council. Something. The SHIRT grants, as are known, I believe they're about worth $2 to $3 billion a year. They have DEI requirements. The federal government itself has DEI job postings all over the place. Provincial governments do, municipal governments do. And again, it's important to understand where this comes from. People who support this are often sincere. I don't doubt that. And they've read things like white privilege theory from an academic from the late 1980s. And they will argue, as do some famous Americans. And again, much of this is American in origin, by the way. It's not Canadian originally. But they
Interesting.
will argue that, look, you need to do this to make up for the past. And my counter argument to that is very simple. Right? Okay. Look, it's one thing to make up for the past when it's a recent wrong. So, as I point out in my book, The Victim Cult, on this issue, it's one thing if you were the Quakers in the late 1700s and you compensate slaves once you free them because you realize what a great evil you've done to them. But that was the Quakers who held slaves, compensating their ex-slaves for the wrong that had been done. It's another
Hmm.
thing. One thing again, we were wrong to the those who were alive at the time, wrongly imprisoned Japanese Canadians in internment camps during the war and stole their property. There was some compensation in the 1950s and 1980s, not enough. But that was a clear wrong done to clear people, actual people, not a group, but I mean, there was actual people who lost their property, who were interned. We were right to compensate them and should have done more. But to try and make up for the past, hundreds of years ago, or some vague notion of, you owe us, we owe you. Much of the restitution or the reconciliation movement today is based on vague claims as opposed to specifics. That's dangerous because basically you're positing one group against another and you're discriminating against people today based on the fact that, again, discrimination happened in the past. But as I mentioned with the example of a Japanese Canadian in the commercial fishery, what did she do wrong where she wasn't allowed to fish in the commercial fishery because of how she looked? Nothing, of course. She did nothing wrong. But a government got it into its head that this was how reconciliation was going to work. This was how they were going to help Native Canadians, who already formed a great part of the commercial fishery at the time on the BC coast. There was nothing to make up for in that case. So we're trapped by people who honestly don't think through this issue critically. They believe they're kind of making up for the past. They don't see the new victims they're creating in the present. It's dangerously illiberal because you're not treating people as individuals, which is why it's anti-merit and illiberal. So because you're not treating them as individuals. So there's a whole bunch of bad thinking all over the place, Paul, as part of the problem here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think people like to think that DEI policies will bring people together. We like that idea
Not only
as
that,
Canadians, and we should, but I think it's doing the opposite, isn't it?
it is. In fact, we commissioned a study on this by a professor in Ontario, David Miller Haskell. Came out in
Okay.
February 2024. You can look it up at AristotleFoundation.org with a lot of the other work we've done on DEI. And what Haskell found it was a literature review, and it was a terrific literature review. All the pro, anti DEI, whatever you want to call it, sort of literature out there, studies, but honest studies that went into, is DEI even doing what it intends, right? Is it bringing people together? No, it's dividing them. People that didn't think in racial categories before are all of a sudden being told they're settler or indigenous, or they're privileged or not, according to how they look, the faith they preach or practice or
Hmm.
don't, their income levels, their ancestry. DEI turned out to be divisive, even by the studies and the authors who liked DEI, who were supportive of it in principle or in theory. So what
Yeah.
David's study found was DEI is divisive. It's doing the opposite of what is intended. So it's terribly harmful and not surprising. Nobody likes to be told you can't have the job or even apply for it because of how you look. Again, where does this work in human history?
Yeah, results matter. I'm sorry, they do, especially in something like this. And how does DEI even line up with our Charter of, rights and freedoms? I mean,
It's
it
allowed.
just seems to me, it
It's allowed.
just, I'm no constitutional lawyer, but it doesn't seem to line up with what, our Constitution guarantees us.
Well, no, it does and it doesn't, unfortunately, right? So Bruce
Okay.
Party, who also wrote a study for us on this time last year. Bruce is a
Mm-hmm.
professor of law at Queen's University in Toronto. Bruce did a wonderful analysis, which we asked him to do. There's two sections to the Constitution. One is Section 15.1, which is the Equality Clause, which basically you're supposed to be treated equally under the law and in policy. But Section 15.2 is kind of the escape clause from 15.1. And to paraphrase or simplify, it basically says, look, if you're part of a group that's been historically disadvantaged, then governments can introduce amelioration. I want to say the word amelioration. They can try and make up for past discrimination, which again gets into the assumptions, which I think are incorrect. But Section 15.2 allows for this
Hmm.
amelioration to recur. In other words, it allows for what used to be called employment equity, affirmative action. Again, very nice sounding names, but which in essence are allowing governments, corporations, universities to discriminate. But that's Section 15.2. That's the ultimate escape clause for this sort of policy in Canada. Whereas in the United States, the Supreme Court there has increasingly taken a very, I think, correct interpretation of their own constitution and the equality of the individual. John Roberts, 20 years ago, said the way to stop racial discrimination is to stop racially discriminating. And that's
How about that?
yeah, that's pretty much been the U.S. Supreme Court's approach over the last 20 years, including with student admissions, which are the most famous cases that have come before it. But in Canada, it is different. So I think what needs to happen in Canada is the concept that you should be able to discriminate based on people's how they look. That should become what I thought we were getting to at one point, post 1960s. That it should be anathema. You shouldn't be allowed to and discriminate against people. Well, you can't change people's minds, but you shouldn't be allowed to think it's okay to actively discriminate against people based on how they look, their gender, ethnicity, where they come from. This was the liberal ideal. When white Southerners were pushing back against this, you had the Americans and very famous Americans, Lyndon B. Johnson, the president, Martin Luther King, of course, up here, Pierre Trudeau and others, say you should treat people as individuals. This was why, in our case, Pierre Trudeau disliked Quebec ethno-nationalists because he thought they were very narrow-minded, and they were. If you weren't Quebec, if you weren't French, pure laine, as they called it, you weren't really a Quebecois. And Pierre Trudeau pushed against this with, ferociousness, as he was right to do. But that was the liberal ideal: treat people as individuals. And we got away from this because of this fascination with identity politics. Well, your income or your result of what you look like. Well, not in a modern liberal democracy, actually.
And this certainly shouldn't be funded by government tax dollars, I would argue. How does DEI play out in the real world, I guess? Are we seeing a lot of employers? I know some do. You see some of the corporate advertisements saying they inclusive is important to them and so forth. They're hiring DEI. It's much less so these days in the States, it seems. And again, that's maybe because of Trump's policies. But where are we at in Canada? Do you know, are jobs going, specifically being advertised as DEI sort of thing, or is it less common in the real world?
I don't know, to be honest. We've done one discrimination index, which was at universities, as I mentioned, which showed a lot of active discrimination. We know from some of the universities like Toronto Metropolitan University, it used to be Ryerson, in the medical admissions program, they discriminate based on identity. Which is bizarre when you think of it. You want a doctor who's capable, not one who just fits boxes.
Yeah.
So it does happen. It's hard to say in the corporate world. I've seen the same sort of virtue signaling. I hate the word virtue signaling. I mean, if it's right to be virtuous, be virtuous. But you've seen the same sort of ads. And again, there's nothing in theory wrong with diversity. I mean, Canada is already a very diverse place, and I think for the most part we're better off for it. But in terms of discrimination based on identity, there's certainly the preachiness about it among corporations.
Yeah.
But one would have to do a deep dive there, I guess. But the problem again is, I would ask any CEO who wants to preach about DEI and hire based on that, are they really comfortable with telling people they can't have a job because of how they look, just because they may look like someone who is, white 100 years ago when white Southerners discriminated against people? How is that relevant to Canada in 2025? Actually, let me give you a great example from Toronto. One of our board members, Roy Ratnaville, one of our first board members, came from Sri Lanka when he was 17 in the late 80s, in 1988, I think it was. And he hates DI. And you know why? Because he saw in Sri Lanka, because he was a Tamil, not the majority in Sri Lanka. There was a civil war on, and he was tortured for his identity because he was a Tamil. So when he comes to Canada, and 40 years later, he sees identity politics in play where people are not getting hired because of how they look. Roy reacts ferociously to this. And he told his own firm, he went from like the mailroom in CI Financial up to the vice president's suite over 40 years. Tremendous success story. And Roy told people who wanted him to practice DI, I will lower their bar, but not the standard. He wanted people to get into the company. He wanted people to succeed like he did. but he didn't have any DEI quota that got him in. He went from the mailroom to the vice president's office as a Sri Lankan Tamil on his own merits. And he was offended by anyone who would have suggested otherwise. But he also understood the danger of identity politics precisely because of experience, as a youth in Sri Lanka, where he was tortured, and he still suffered from PTSD because of that. So that's the problem with DEI is, again, you're not looking at people as individuals.
And we need to start doing that as soon as possible. How do we get there from here, though? Okay, when how do we reduce or DEI hiring practices and hire people again because of who they are as an individual? What kind of character do you have? What kind of qualifications? What kind of merit do you have? What can viewers do to actually propel our government policies to maybe change a bit?
Right. Well, I don't want to be Pollyannish or simplistic. I mean, I think a lot of this is pretty deeply entrenched. A lot of people see this is the best thing to do for all the reasons we've talked about, Paul. I think one can start by telling the truth. I mean, one of the reasons I set up the Aristotle Foundation, as did the board and now the staff, is because I looked at these policies around the country and thought somebody needs to address this. I remember talking to a lady from Toronto who emailed me and said, "Is Black Lives?" She was on a parent-student council in Toronto. Said Black Lives Matter and the claims of institutional racism, systemic racism. Do you have anything to counter this? I sent her to my book, The Victim Cult, which had been released the year before. But I said, we're setting up a think tank, but that'll be 3 years down the road, as it was. But I think people have to start by being honest about this, which is what we're trying to do. Here's the claim. Here's why it's incorrect in our best estimation.
I mean, I like what you're saying. I mean, we just need to, maybe we're a bit scared as Canadians, we want to be nice, but you still need to be nice about it. But actually, here's the truth. And I'm out of time. I gotta leave it there, Mark. So I apologize, just up against the clock, but I want to steer people to your website to get more truth, AristotleFoundation.org. Thanks so much for watching, folks. WizeUp.ca.